Hi guys, Jake here, and today marks the 6th anniversary of Database Ranger's Power Reviews. In light of the occasion, I decided I wanted to try something a little different. Now, don't worry, I still intend on doing a writer log for Build, and a trailer for the newest episode of DRPR, but for today, I wanted to do a test run for a new series I've been thinking about for a long time, called Conversations in Context, where we take a look at some of the issues facing our world today through the lens of some popular media tropes. And considering that we're now about halfway through October, I can think of no better lens for our first subject than the concept of monsters. Let's dive in. Monsters have been a part of the Power Rangers franchise since almost the beginning. Pudgy Pig first appearing in Food Fight 1 week after the premiere, followed by Bones and the Giant in the actual second episode, High Five. Yeah, airing schedules for this show have always been weird. Since then, we've seen monsters based on Western mythology, Eastern mythology, household objects, creepy critters. We've seen monsters made of clay, summoned by magic, built from scrap, having entire planets all to themselves, and we've seen monsters take the form of aliens, robots, demons, mutants, and the crude drawings of a spoiled child. And regardless of whether they're captured in cards, turned into action figures, or flat out blown up, almost every monster inevitably faces the same fate: fiery defeat at the hands of their enemies. Suffice to say, when villains send their monsters, they're not sending their best. They're sending kidnappers, they're sending bombers, they're bunglers, and some, we assume, are good people. Yeah, we're kind of going there on this one. Note, I'm definitely not by any means trying to say that maligned minorities are supposed to be monsters, or that the show is trying to present these monsters as maligned minorities, with the occasional exception of Power Rangers Time Force. Keep in mind, though, that drawing these parallels as experiments in empathy is nothing new to media. Beauty and the Beast is perhaps the most classic example of defying societal norms and seeing past appearances to love an outsider, while The Shape of Water recently won the Academy Award for Best Picture by drawing parallels between a captive fishman and the often monstrous treatment towards the disabled, the LGBT community, and people of color. However, what I would like to discuss here is more specifically the oddly myopic nature of sympathy. Now, to explain what I mean by that, let's go back to those exploding rubber suit monsters. Now, when you see a monster being destroyed, how do you feel? Happy? Excited? Relieved? Maybe you don't feel anything at all and are just waiting to get back to the subplot of the week. But how often do you actually feel sad for the monster? There have been a few cases over the years that have intentionally evoked a sympathetic response, but they have been very clear that these are exceptions and not the rule. Whether it's Lost Galaxy's Loyax trying to find redemption through one last battle, or Time Force's Nauticon preferring a life of silent captivity to trying to survive in a hostile human world. Even then, these monsters require Rangers to act as their advocates, making it clear that these monsters are the good ones. So why is it that we so rarely feel sympathy for these monsters being destroyed? It might seem like a silly question, but let's really think about that. Monsters are often presented with jovial personalities, have their own agency, and sometimes just feel like hanging out with their fellow monster friends. While they are supposed to be somewhat threatening, their actual crimes rarely amount to more than getting people to act weird, yelling in the streets, getting physically aggressive, and committing minor property damage. At least until they grow building-sized, but usually at that point they've already been blown up at least once. My point is, does anything I've just described sound like it should warrant the death penalty? Because honestly, if that's true, then the entire city of Philadelphia should be forbidden from ever again winning the World Series. But no one is suggesting that we blow up the entire city of Philadelphia. I hope no one is suggesting that we blow up Philadelphia. So, why are we so okay with blowing up monsters? Well, there might be some obvious answers here, but I want to focus on how these things are framed. Where one is framed as a fictional, world-ending threat that must be destroyed, the other is just a scenario of real-life sports fans who got a bit out of control in their celebrations. Now, clearly, these are two very different things, but very often, framing can affect how different groups of people view the same exact event. Where one group may view this gathering as an unruly mob, another may view it as a righteous protest, depending on how the reports of the gathering are being framed. And that's where we get to the real meat of this discussion, which I referred to earlier as the myopic nature of sympathy. Why it is that we feel sympathy in some situations, but not others. And to understand that, let's take a look at why we don't feel sympathy when the average Power Rangers monster is destroyed. From the beginning, monsters were depicted as things that were created by evil beings for evil purposes, starting from Finster's clay sculptures. Even the language being used, destroyed, implies that you're dealing with an object, because, after all, you can't kill a lump of clay. Now, that being said, the show did evolve past this, showing monsters from different planets who sometimes even had their own personal histories. But that didn't really change how they were treated in the series. They were still monsters, and it had already been established that their destruction was not only acceptable, but justified. I mean, look at them. It's not like they're humans, right? Sympathy and empathy are both dependent upon the ability to understand someone else's misfortune or emotions through some form of connection or commonality. One of the easiest ways to bypass sympathy is by using visual shorthand to make it very clear to the audience that this character is not like you. They don't look like you. They don't act like you. They don't eat what you eat. It's all obviously just a show, right? It's all fake. It's all just TV. And when you die, you don't erupt in a fiery explosion. Except, there are people who don't look like you, who don't act like you, who don't eat what you eat, who you only know through TV and other people's stories, and sometimes, when they die, it can be very violent. Do these people still deserve your sympathy? Well, you might say, that depends. Were they good guys or bad guys? Heroes or villains? In Power Rangers, they try to make that distinction very simple. The good guys are humans, and the bad guys are monsters. There are some exceptions where non-humans are also good guys, and these cases are always made very explicit, with the heroes acting as their advocates. But what do you do when the bad guy has a human face? You can't destroy something that looks like one of the good guys, right? Well, then you're left with two choices. Either make them a good guy, or make them a monster. It doesn't seem to matter whether they've demonstrated any redeeming actions before this point. The visual shorthand of having humanity is too powerful, and it needs to be erased before a character can be destroyed. Otherwise, they just have too much in common with the audience, and that commonality often overrides their past actions. While this may all be heavily simplified, it does reflect a phenomenon that you may often observe in news media. Depending upon the framing of the story, a person may be depicted with a flattering or unflattering photo, or with flattering or unflattering language, depending upon whether they are being shown as in the right or in the wrong. And in lieu of any other form of context, these framing devices determine our level of sympathy. But all that being said, context does matter a lot. The only two seasons that pardoned monsters from the fate of being destroyed were SPD and Time Force, and that has much less to do with the monsters themselves and more to do with the Rangers, who, in these seasons, were being presented as law enforcement officers. And it didn't really matter if we were seeing living children's drawings being granted more mercy than ancient alien life. What mattered is that the Rangers were being treated as cops, and cops only ever capture criminals. They don't kill them, right? Except, sometimes they do. And when that happens, it can create a dissonance. Cops are supposed to be the good guys, so he must have had a good reason. And criminals are the bad guys, so he must have deserved it. And suddenly, when viewed through this framework of allocating sympathy, deadly consequences can seem perfectly reasonable for relatively minor crimes. This is because, in real life, we don't have foam rubber suits to tell us who the bad guys are. So instead, we find other ways to make these distinctions, based on what side of the law someone is on, what nationality or what religion or skin tone or political party, and we end up forgetting that we all have the commonality of being human. We're not just lumps of clay with fixed alignments. We all have the capacity to commit good or bad actions, which we may or may not feel justified in committing, according to the frameworks through which we view the world. There have been a lot of situations over the years where people have had difficulty applying sympathy to victims of terrible circumstances. Whether they be hurricanes, school shootings, or forced separation from family members. I would love to talk about all of these things, and more, but there's too much to cover in one video, so instead, I quickly want to talk about the recent events that got me thinking about this subject. Brett Kavanaugh was nominated to a position on the United States Supreme Court this past summer, and during the course of his confirmation hearings, Allegations were brought forth by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford that he had assaulted her while they were both high school students in the early 1980s. Despite additional allegations, heated debates, impassioned protests, and a brief FBI investigation, Kavanaugh was successfully confirmed and sworn in. This is a very abbreviated account of the events that basically rocked the nation for several weeks. But the part that I really want to look at, and that I personally found the most fascinating, was how, while observing people on both sides of the debate, I saw a deep and genuine sympathy for whichever side they supported, whether it was Ford or Kavanaugh. It was not the lack of sympathy, but how it was being allocated. Now, obviously, there was a wide spectrum of viewpoints, with some people being uninterested, undecided, or in some ways sympathizing with both parties being in an undesirable situation. But there were people who were sick with sorrow on behalf of Dr. Ford, and others who were also sick with sorrow on behalf of Judge Kavanaugh. Each side was willing to call out the other for their expressions of sympathy being fake or somehow invalid, but I believe that it really came down to the different frameworks they were using to interpret events. In the case of Judge Kavanaugh, I'm sure that many people, whether consciously or subconsciously, thought, this is someone who looks like me, or my father, or my brother, who shares my political views, who has a good education, who has a loving family, who is active in the community, who is well-liked by his friends, who is a representative of the court, so he must be a good guy, right? And a good guy couldn't possibly do what they're saying, so they must be lying. They must be the bad guys, because even if he did do what they're saying he did, I'm sure he had a good reason, right? Because otherwise, if someone I sympathize this much with could really do something that scarred an innocent person for life, what does that say about me? Well, it says that you're human. And humans sometimes do terrible things. And in the case of Dr. Ford, I'm sure many people saw her and thought, this is someone who looks just like me, or my sister, or my daughter, and she's been through the same pain that I've been through, and how can these people, these monsters, ignore her pain, ignore my pain, when we've already been through so much? Sympathy is a very personal thing, because who we choose to sympathize with reflects back on us. And we all want to believe that we're the good guys, and that we could never be the bad guys. But we can't let that blind us to our own hidden biases, and we can't let a lack of sympathy justify unjust actions like death threats or harassment, which both Dr. Ford and Judge Kavanaugh have faced. Because when someone believes that they can do no wrong, that's how real monsters are born. So, I hope this conversation has given you something to think about. And since I do want this to actually be a conversation in context, I very much want to hear what you have to say. So, please, comment below and let me know what you think about the nature of sympathy and how it applies to the challenges that we face. And if you have an opinion on how this applies to the context of the Kavanaugh controversies, please definitely share that as well. I know that I'm not always great at replying to comments, but I will do my best to do so for this video. And by all means, share this video with your family and friends, especially those you might not agree with, and try to have a conversation about it. Maybe, if you both keep your minds open, one might change. Personally, I believe Dr. Ford. That's not because of any common experiences, but because when I work to strip away my biases, I can't deny that false allegations of assault are extremely rare, generally in the range of 2 to 10%. And most of those allegations are made by people who either have a specific mental illness or criminal history or clear motivations of revenge, none of which appears to apply to Dr. Ford. Plus, the possibility of mistaken identity goes down exponentially when the perpetrator is someone who the victim already knows through other contexts, and these two were clearly not complete strangers. And when I take into account the other 2 allegations made against him, with similar levels of credibility, the odds of them all being false are so small that, honestly, any doubts that I have regarding Kavanaugh's guilt don't really feel like reasonable ones. But again, that's my personal view. Whether you agree, disagree, please let me know in the comments below. All I ask is that you try to be respectful. And if you have any requests for future conversations in context, let me know. I'd love to do more of these if I can find the time, and I hope you all enjoyed this first outing. In the meantime, thank you all for an amazing 6 years, whether you've been with the channel since the beginning or have only just been introduced. I look forward to producing new content as we work through to the end of the main DRPR series, and finding new ways to entertain you guys and hopefully helping to make this world a slightly better place. So, until then, farewell, Ranger fans, and let the power protect you.